My parents called me to their house after my brother's debt became a family crisis, and my father said, "You need to sell your home to save him." I showed them the financial records and calmly replied, "I will help him learn responsibility, but I won't destroy my future." They never expected my next decision. When my mother called and said we needed to talk as a family, I already knew it was going to be bad. I just did not know how bad. I had been at work when the call came in, and I almost ignored it because my parents only used that tone when something had already gone wrong, and they wanted me to arrive after they had all agreed on the version of events they wanted me to hear. I called back during my lunch break, and my mother sounded too careful, which was usually a sign that she was trying not to upset my father or my brother. She told me to come by that evening because there was something important about my brother Ryan that could not wait. Ryan being the center of a crisis was not new. What was new was the part where my mother made it sound like the whole family was already involved. I drove to my parents' house after work with that dull knot in my stomach that only comes when you know someone has decided your life is now their backup plan. I had not lived there in more than a decade, but the neighborhood still felt the same. Too many trimmed lawns, too many porch lights on before sunset, too many houses where people seemed to be pretending things were fine while quietly drowning in debt. My parents' house looked smaller than it used to, which I guess is what happens when you stop seeing a place through the eyes of a kid. Ryan was already there when I arrived. So was my father. My mother had food on the table that nobody was touching. There were papers spread out in the living room like they had been dumped there in a hurry, and then rearranged to look more organized than they really were. Nobody looked at me for long. That was usually my first clue that I was not being invited into a conversation so much as being assigned a role. My father did not waste time. He said Ryan had gotten himself into serious debt, and the situation had become too big for them to manage alone. He said the family had to pull together. He said that because I had the only real asset left, I needed to do the responsible thing and sell my home to save my brother. I remember looking at him for a long second because I honestly thought I had misheard him. I had bought my house 6 years earlier after working 2 jobs and living in an apartment so cheap it should have been illegal. It was not a mansion. It was a normal, modest place with an aging roof and a backyard I was still trying to fix one section at a time. It was also the first thing in my life that was fully mine. My father said it like he was asking me to move a piece on a chessboard. Ryan did not say anything. That alone told me more than the rest of the room. I asked how much debt we were talking about. My mother started explaining in pieces. Credit cards, a personal loan, late rent, an old car note, some medical bills that had somehow become urgent, a consolidation loan that had not worked out. The numbers changed every time someone else spoke, which made me think nobody in the room had the full picture except maybe Ryan. When I asked for the total, my father gave me a figure that was large enough to make my stomach turn and vague enough to hide every ugly detail inside it. He said it was around the price of a modest house in our area. My home. The room got very quiet after that. Then my father repeated that I needed to sell. Not maybe. Not consider. Need. I remember feeling strangely calm, which was probably the result of being so shocked that my brain had switched over into something colder just to stay functional. I had expected a plea. I had expected pressure. I had even expected guilt. I had not expected them to look at my house as if it were a spare battery they could pull out of the wall and plug into Ryan until he felt better. I had brought a folder with me, mostly because I had learned long ago that family emergencies usually came with missing facts. Inside were printed bank statements, payment records, and a spreadsheet I had started 2 years earlier after Ryan asked me for help with what he said was a temporary rent problem. That first loan had been small, then there had been another, then one for car repair, then one for medical copay, then one because he was waiting on a commission check, then one because he had been between jobs. None of them had been paid back on time, and several had not been paid back at all. I had started keeping track after I realized I was being told one thing while the bank transfers showed something else. At the time, I told myself I was just being careful. That evening, I realized I had been preparing for this conversation without knowing it. I set the folder on the coffee table and told them I was not selling my home. My father immediately tried to argue that I did not understand the severity of the situation. He said Ryan could lose everything. He said collectors were calling. He said the house could be lost, the car could be repossessed, and my brother might have his wages garnished. He said I was being selfish because I had equity while Ryan had nothing. That was the first time I noticed my mother flinch when he said equity, like the word itself was embarrassing. I opened the folder and started laying out the papers one by one. I showed them the money I had already sent to help Ryan over the last several years. I showed them the deposits I had made to my parents when my father had said the water heater needed replacing, and when my mother had said the pharmacy would not refill a prescription without payment first. I showed them the check I had written to cover Ryan when he got behind on a security deposit. I showed them the transfer history with notes in the memo lines that were depressing in hindsight because I had been so determined to be decent about it. I had receipts for things they had all managed to forget once they were no longer convenient. My father looked at the pages, but only long enough to confirm that I had, in fact, been responsible. That seemed to annoy him more than if I had done nothing at all. He said all of that was beside the point. I remember that sentence because it said everything about how he thought about money. As long as it was already spent, it became irrelevant. As long as it came from someone else, it could be treated like background noise. I asked Ryan how much of the debt was from actual living expenses and how much was from him making bad decisions. He would not answer directly. He kept saying it was complicated. That word was always a bad sign. Complicated usually meant embarrassing, or illegal, or both. I asked for the statements again. My mother hesitated, then slid a thick stack across the table. I should have felt sympathy first. I did feel some, to be honest. But the first thing I noticed was not the total balance. It was the pattern. The charges were not just rent and groceries and gas. There were cash advances. There were sportsbook withdrawals. There were purchases at electronics stores that did not make sense for someone who was supposedly living hand to mouth. There were weekend charges at Casino Adams. There were repeated transfers to an account that was not in Ryan's name. I went back through the pages twice because I thought maybe I was missing something obvious. I was not. The story they had been telling me did not match the paper in front of me. That was the moment the room changed for me. Not emotionally. Practically, I stopped thinking of it as a plea and started thinking of it as a problem that had been badly hidden. My father kept talking about family obligation and loyalty. My mother started crying quietly, which immediately put me on edge because she only cried when she had run out of ways to control a conversation. Ryan finally admitted, in the most roundabout way possible, that he had taken out more than one loan and that he had hoped things would turn around before anyone found out how bad it had gotten. He also said it with that peculiar tone people use when they are trying to make their disaster sound like a weather event instead of a choice. I asked who had signed what. That was when the room really shifted. My father said he had signed some paperwork because he thought it was temporary. My mother looked away. Ryan stared at the floor. I did not need to hear more to know that this had been happening for a while, and that I had likely been the last person in the family to be told, because I was the one least likely to be manipulated into paying for it. I asked for copies of everything. My father said he did not see why I needed them. That was the first hint that somebody in the room was afraid of the paperwork more than the debt. I told them again that I was not selling my home. Then I said the part that came out calmer than I felt. I said I would help Ryan learn responsibility, but I would not destroy my future. Nobody in that room liked hearing the word responsibility attached to Ryan. It had never really belonged to him in their minds. It belonged to me. I had always been the one who paid on time, showed up on time, and fixed things without making a performance out of it. That was the curse of being the dependable one. People started expecting you to be dependable in the way a chair is dependable. You do not get thanked for not collapsing. You just get sat on harder. My father said I was making this about myself. That was almost funny given the ask. I told him I was making it about numbers because the numbers were what mattered. He said numbers did not mean anything without context. I said the context was that Ryan had been living beyond his means for years while everyone else in the family quietly patched the holes. He denied the idea that anyone had been quietly patching anything. Then my mother, without looking at me, said I had not seen everything. That sentence sat in the room like a dropped glass. I asked what she meant. She said nothing at first. My father told her to stop. Ryan started rubbing the back of his neck, which was a habit he had whenever he was trying to decide whether to lie or confess. I did not push for a dramatic answer. I just waited. That is something I learned a long time ago. People reveal more when they are uncomfortable, and you do not rescue them from it too quickly. Eventually, my mother admitted that the family had already used part of their savings and had taken out a home equity line on their house about 2 years earlier. The official explanation had been that Ryan needed time to recover from a bad stretch. The real explanation, which nobody said out loud but was obvious to me now, was that they had already been bailing him out and hiding it from each other in layers. The debt was not new. The crisis was that the hiding had finally failed. I looked around that living room, and for the first time I understood why the papers had been spread out like evidence at a crime scene. They were trying to build a story that made the sacrifice sound noble. What it really was a family that had been living on borrowed time and now wanted me to mortgage my own life to keep their illusion intact. I took a breath, gathered the papers, and told them I was leaving for the night. My father told me I was abandoning them. My mother said I was being harsh. Ryan did not say much, which annoyed me even more because silence from him always seemed to mean he was waiting to see whether someone else would absorb the consequences first. I walked out without slamming the door. That mattered to me for some reason. I was angry, but I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a dramatic exit they could later blame for their feelings. The drive home was the first time my hands actually shook. Not much, just enough to remind me I was human. I kept thinking about the way my father had said sell your home with the confidence of someone who had already decided my hard work was communal property. I kept thinking about how quickly the room had turned on me once I refused. And I kept thinking about Ryan because the worst part was not that he had messed up. It was that he had looked at my life as the emergency fund for his bad habits. At home, I spread the papers across my kitchen table and started sorting them into stacks. I put the original family loan requests in one pile. I put the transfers I had made in another. I put the bank statements in a third. Then I opened the spreadsheet I had been keeping and started adding the amounts again from scratch, because I wanted to be certain I was not exaggerating anything out of anger. I was not. I had sent more than enough over the years to cover a serious chunk of Ryan's mistakes, and that did not include the favors I had done that never touched a bank account. I remembered all the times I had been told he just needed a little breathing room. I remembered the times my parents had said he was under stress. I remembered the birthdays where they had acted like I was unreasonable for not pretending the latest emergency was unique. The pattern was suddenly impossible to ignore. Ryan was not unlucky. He was protected, and I had been helping keep that protection in place without meaning to. I slept badly that night. The next morning I did something I had never done before with a family issue. I made an appointment with a lawyer, not to sue anyone, not to start a war, just to understand what my options were and to make sure nobody could drag my house into a mess I had not agreed to. The lawyer was patient in the way professionals usually are when they can tell the person sitting across from them has already been through 6 layers of family nonsense before breakfast. She asked me to summarize the situation, and I gave her the facts in order. My brother's debts, my parents' house, the home equity line, the requests for me to sell my home, the transfers I had already made, the statements that looked wrong, the pressure to act immediately. She did not seem surprised by any of it. That in itself was depressing. She told me to get copies of the loan documents, the home equity paperwork, and anything that showed how the funds had actually been used. She also told me not to sign anything and not to agree to be a temporary bridge for anything, because temporary family fixes have a way of becoming permanent obligations. I left her office feeling steadier, not good. Steadier, there is a difference. I drove straight to my parents' house afterward because I had decided I needed the paperwork before anyone could rewrite the story again. This time only my mother was home. She looked relieved to see me, which made me suspicious immediately. She also looked exhausted in a way I had not noticed before, and I had to admit that while I was angry at her, I was also starting to understand that she had been helping hold together a lie for so long that she might not have known how to set it down. She gave me the loan packets after a long pause. I think she assumed I was there to change my mind. I was not. I sat at their kitchen table and went line by line through the refinancing documents. That was where things got worse. The home equity line had not just been used to consolidate old debt. A significant chunk had gone to pay off charges that matched Ryan's debts almost exactly. There were also cash disbursements that had no documentation beyond vague labels and a notary stamp that looked rushed. I noticed one of the signatures did not match my father's usual handwriting. I am not a handwriting expert, but I had seen enough of his nonsense over the years to know he signed slower when he was careful and more crooked when he was annoyed. This signature looked like somebody who wanted to imitate a careful man without actually being one. My mother admitted after a lot of hesitation that Ryan had brought some of the paperwork home and that my father had signed because he was tired of the arguments. That explained more than it should have. Ryan had not just been reckless, he had been relentless. He had worn them down into compliance and then used their fear of public embarrassment to keep them quiet. That was the part I had initially missed. I had thought they were enabling him out of favoritism. They were doing that, yes, but they were also being cornered in their own house. The difference mattered because it meant this was not just a story about a spoiled brother. It was also about 2 parents who had confused keeping the peace with keeping the truth buried. I took copies of everything and told my mother that I was still not selling my house. I also told her that if they wanted help, I would help them create a real plan. A real one. No more hidden transfers. No more vague promises. No more assuming my future was available as a patch kit. She cried again, but this time it felt less manipulative and more like she had finally realized I was not going to keep silently absorbing the fallout forever. When I got home, I pulled a full credit report on myself because I did not trust the situation anymore. Nothing was opened in my name. That was a relief. It was also, strangely, a little disappointing, because it would have made the legal path clearer if there had been actual fraud tied to me. Instead, what I had was something uglier in a different way. A family of adults had made a string of bad choices and now wanted me to turn my house into the consequence buffer. I spent the next 2 days doing what I always do when I am upset but trying to stay useful. I collected documents. I reconciled transfers. I built a timeline. I highlighted dates where Ryan's claims did not match the bank records. I pulled emails and text confirmations from my own inbox. I even printed out old messages from my father thanking me for helping with one thing or another, because I suspected they had all started to blur together in everyone else's memory. By the end of it, the story was almost embarrassingly clear. Whenever Ryan had a financial blow-up, the family had found a way to keep it inside the walls. If they ran short, they borrowed against the house. If the house could not cover it, they came to me. If I hesitated, they treated my hesitation like betrayal. My next decision was the one they really did not expect. I sent my brother an email through the same address he used for loans and bills. I attached the timeline. I attached the transfer records. I attached the loan documents. Then I wrote that I would not sell my home, would not co-sign anything, and would not make any more informal payments toward his debt. I also wrote that if he wanted any further help from me, it would have to be through a formal repayment plan with a financial counselor present, not because I wanted control, because I wanted a paper trail. I gave him 48 hours to respond before I would take the documents to the lender and ask them to review every transaction connected to the home equity line. That was not a threat in my mind. It was a warning. If there was one thing I had learned from years of watching Ryan operate, it was that consequences only seemed real to him once another adult made them official. He replied within an hour, not with accountability, with panic. He wrote that I did not understand how bad it was and that if I made things harder, the family would fall apart. He also wrote in a way that made my skin crawl that he had been counting on me because I was the only one in the family who had done anything right with money. That sentence was so honest it was almost accidental. It confirmed exactly how he saw me, not as a person, as a reserve. I forwarded the reply to my lawyer. She told me to keep everything. I then did the second thing they never expected. I went to the lender, not to negotiate, to ask for a review of the file and to report that the debt situation had been misrepresented to me and possibly to them as well. The woman at the bank was professional in the way people are when they have already heard every flavor of disaster a household can produce. She reviewed the account notes. She reviewed the payment history. She noticed the same odd patterns I had noticed. The cash advances, the rushed signatures, the questionable withdrawals, the correspondence address that had changed more than once. She told me carefully that some of it might not violate policy on its own, but enough of it warranted a formal review. That was the moment I realized the family had been so focused on me as the solution that they had not considered I might be the beginning of their problems being exposed. I went home and sat in my driveway for a while before going inside. I was angry, but I was also exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. All I had done so far was refuse to be destroyed politely, yet somehow it already felt like I had crossed a line my family had assumed I would never cross. The fallout started the next afternoon. My father called, and then my mother, and then Ryan sent a string of messages that alternated between guilt and rage. Nobody directly said it, but the message was obvious. I had made the family look bad by refusing to keep lying with them. That idea would have been funny if it had not been so familiar. People like that love to call truth-telling harmful when what they really mean is that it interferes with the arrangement. I went back to my parents' house one more time because I wanted the conversation documented in person. I brought my lawyer's contact information, my printed records, and a calm face I had practiced in the car. They were all there again. This time the atmosphere was different, less pleading, more resentment. My father said I had gone behind the family's back. I pointed out that I was not the one who had hidden a home equity line and multiple debt problems until they became unavoidable. My mother said she thought I would understand because family helps family. I told her I did understand. That was exactly why I had already helped, more than once, more than enough. Ryan looked furious by that point, which I had to admit was interesting, because his anger always seemed to arrive right after he realized the free option might be disappearing. He tried to argue that if I sold my house, the debt could be cleared, the house could be saved, and everyone could move on. I asked him what moved on meant in his mind. Did it mean he would change his spending? Did it mean he would stop gambling? Did it mean he would sign over his accounts and sell the truck he had bought right before things collapsed? Did it mean my parents would stop acting like I was an emergency fund with legs? Nobody answered that directly. That was answer enough. I then told them that I was willing to help with a budget, a repayment plan, or a bankruptcy consultation. I was even willing to cover the cost of a credit counselor for a few sessions. What I would not do was liquidate the only stable asset I had built for myself just because their version of family had turned into financial arson. My father called that irresponsible. I remember that because it was almost insulting in its irony. He said I was letting pride get in the way of loyalty. I said no. I was letting math get in the way of manipulation. That was the closest I came to a sharp tone, and even then I kept it controlled. The room went still again. Then I did the decision they truly had not prepared for. I told them I had already spoken to the lender, and that if the home equity line had been used in ways that were misrepresented, I would help provide the documentation for a formal review. I also said that if Ryan had used any of my parents' accounts or signatures without full consent, that was no longer a family problem but a legal one. The silence after that was so complete I could hear the refrigerator hum. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at the floor. Nobody was prepared for the possibility that I would stop acting like the family wall and start acting like a witness. That was the exact shift that changed everything. The next week was ugly. The lender opened a review. My parents had to produce statements they clearly did not want examined. Ryan suddenly had a much harder time pretending the numbers were temporary. It turned out he had not only used the home equity line to cover previous debts. He had also kept drawing from side accounts and had been making himself look more solvent than he was by shifting payments around when he knew someone was checking. Nothing in there was movie-style fraud, but it was enough to show a pattern of deception that had been hidden behind family shame and a lot of wishful thinking. The most humiliating part for Ryan, from what I could tell, was that the lender did not care about his excuses. They cared about the paper. Paper is rude that way. It does not care who was stressed. It does not care who felt pressured. It just sits there and tells the truth in a way people cannot argue with forever. The bank ended up insisting on a restructuring process. That meant my parents could not keep pretending they were just one lucky month away from fixing everything. They were going to have to make a real decision. Ryan would have to either accept a formal repayment plan and submit to serious oversight, or the debt would keep tightening until assets had to be sold. For the first time in years, his bad choices could not be absorbed by family theater. My father was furious with me for weeks. My mother was quieter, which somehow hurt more. Ryan was openly hostile, then strangely defensive, then hostile again. He sent me one message saying I had betrayed him when he was already drowning. That one actually made me laugh, though not because it was funny, because it was exactly the kind of self-pitying language he had used for years to turn consequences into cruelty. I did not answer. I had stopped trying to translate selfishness into crisis for him. About a month later, my mother called to ask whether I still meant what I had said about helping with a budget. I said yes. She sounded relieved and ashamed at the same time. We met at a coffee shop instead of the house this time, which I preferred because nobody can perform innocence as easily in public when there is a table full of receipts. She brought the updated statements. I brought a notebook and a calculator. We went through every category: utilities, groceries, insurance, minimum payments, late fees, interest. The numbers were ugly, but they were real. For once, nobody was trying to make them prettier. She admitted that she and my father had known more about Ryan's spending habits than they had been willing to admit. They had told themselves they were protecting him. What they had really been doing was protecting their own sense of what a good family was supposed to look like. That was not the same thing. I told her I understood why she had done it, and that I was not interested in humiliating her for it. I also told her that protecting Ryan had cost everyone else too much, and that the cost had finally reached me. She did not argue. That was another sign things were changing. My parents eventually stopped asking me to sell my house. They had no real choice by then. The lender had seen enough of the actual numbers. Ryan ended up having to sell his truck, close a side account he had been hiding, and enter a formal debt management program that came with very little room for the kind of nonsense he had been living on. He was not suddenly fixed. People are not rebooted by paperwork. But he was forced, finally, to live inside consequences instead of outside them. My father hated that. My mother seemed sad, but also relieved. I think she had spent so long bracing for the next lie that honesty felt almost uncomfortable at first. As for me, I kept my house. I also kept my savings. That part still feels important to say because there was a real moment where I could have made the emotional choice instead of the sensible one and paid for it for years. Instead, I used the money I had set aside for emergencies to finish a few long-ignored repairs at my own place. I fixed the roof leak. I replaced part of the fence. I paid down some of my own mortgage principal. None of it was dramatic. All of it mattered. A couple of months after everything blew up, I got invited to a family dinner at my parents' house again. I almost did not go. Then I decided to because avoiding them forever would have been its own kind of surrender. The atmosphere was awkward but calmer. Ryan kept to himself. My father acted older somehow, like the whole episode had stolen a kind of confidence he used to wear without thinking. My mother seemed quieter in a way that made me think she was finally tired of pretending dysfunction was the same thing as loyalty. Nobody apologized perfectly. Families rarely do. But there was less pretending than before, and that counted for something. My father never said he had been wrong to ask me to sell my home. I do not think he is capable of framing it that way. What he did do was stop repeating the idea that my future was the family emergency fund. That was enough for me. Ryan never thanked me. I did not expect him to. What he did do after a while was stop asking for money. That may sound small, but anyone who has dealt with a chronic bailout artist knows it is not small at all. It is the difference between being seen as a person and being treated like a loophole. Over time, my relationship with my parents got better in a limited but real way. There was still some resentment. There was still the occasional guilt trip from my father when he got frustrated. There was still a tendency for my mother to act as if I should be grateful for being left out of the worst of it. But the dynamic changed because I changed it, not by exploding, not by punishing them, just by refusing to step into the role they had assigned me when that role would have cost me everything I had built. That is the part I think people miss when they hear stories like this. The victory was not some dramatic courtroom scene. It was not the family being destroyed in one glorious afternoon. It was me sitting at a table with bank statements and saying no without apology. It was me checking my own records before trusting anyone else. It was me calling the lender instead of pretending the numbers would somehow fix themselves. It was me accepting that helping people does not mean volunteering to be ruined alongside them. I still think about that night sometimes. Not because I regret refusing. I do not. I think about how normal the ask sounded in my father's mouth and how insane it actually was. Sell your home to save your brother. As if my stability was just the next thing available for sacrifice. As if my life had been a spare part the family could remove and install wherever needed. They really did not expect my next decision, and maybe that is why it worked. I did not yell. I did not beg. I did not negotiate from guilt. I just started following the paper trail, and the paper trail said what all the talking around it had tried to hide for years. Ryan's debt was real. My parents had enabled it, and my home was not the answer. The most satisfying part is that I never had to become cruel to stop being used. I just had to become precise. And once I did, the facts took care of the rest.